Hello, welcome to Picture Me Coding with Eric Aker and Mike Mull. Hi, Mike.
Hey there.
Mike, you recommended a record to me by a band that I think the band's called Geese and the record's called Getting Killed. So it's kind of like getting killed by geese or something like that. I was confused when you recommended it to me. Can you tell me about this record? I still don't know what to think about that thing.
I'm not sure what to think about it either, except I really, really like it. I'm not entirely sure I can explain why. It's different, but it's not weird. You know, it's fairly conventional music, but there's just something different about it compared to what's sort of the normal thing in indie rock these days. And
I didn't find it that conventional. I found it kind of unpredictable when I was just like, whoa, this is surprising. Like the first song is a little bit Jesus lizardy, kind of ragey.
Yeah, the first song is a little bit surprising. There's this part where he's screaming, "There's a bomb in my car," which is kind of strange. But
yeah. And then the second one comes on and it's completely different. I was like, what is going on here? This is a surprising record.
There's a track on here called Taxes, and you know, Spotify has this thing. Spotify is probably my primary listening environment, for better or worse, and they have this thing where they will play a song. They'll start to play songs at random after you've listened to something on the assumption that those songs are similar. And they started playing this song Taxes for me probably in the spring. And I kept hearing it over and over and again. I was like, I really like this song. I'm going to save this album for when it comes out just to see if the rest of the album is as good. Mm-hmm. And long story short, I think it is as good, but if you have heard the song Taxes and you think it's going to be 10 songs like that, it's not.
Yeah.
So
yeah. If you listen to the first and you're like, whoa, this is a little intense. What's the rest of it like? It's not at all like the first song.
I figured this was just going to be, sort of a breakout indie band that would have some popularity and you'd see them on tour, but apparently they've sort of latched onto something. And I read an article about how they're kind of all over TikTok. And some critic has claimed them to be the first great Gen Z indie band. So I'm not sure what exactly that means, but anyway, I really like this, but I can't totally articulate why.
You know, the other thing I have is it reminds me of stuff that I have trouble putting my finger on.
Same. Yeah. And I think one of the sort of key things about it, and that stands out to me anyway, is that the singer has a very interesting voice. And interestingly enough, I think his name is Cameron Winter. He put out a solo album earlier this year with the title Heavy Metal, which was not at all heavy metal, but it was also kind of a surprise hit. And maybe that's part of the reasons why this album was more anticipated than it might have been otherwise. But in any case, I encourage people to give it a listen. I think
the band is called Geese and the record is Getting Killed, and it's a surprising and weird record.
And there's also a band called Goose, so don't get confused there.
And Mike says it's conventional sounding, and I didn't find it to be. So it's already splitting opinion here.
So divisive.
On the music podcast about software, Picture Me Coding, it is a divisive piece of music, but we both like it. Mike loves it. I'm still like, I think I like this phase of my relationship with it. Mike, for our primary topic today, I wanted to ask you, did you know there's a group of developers who have rewritten core utils in Rust? Core utils is the venerable collection of utilities for the shell that includes over 100 commands that are familiar to us. We use them every single day. Commands like ls and mv and rm and countless others. Well, they are countful, actually, not countless. They're rewriting in Rust. Did you know about this? Did you hear about this?
I've heard about it, but it's entirely possible that I heard about it because you told me.
So here's a thought I had. We were recently discussing the history of Unix. It was such a fascinating discussion, and my brain just keeps kind of tripping back to the pleasant memories of reading Brian Kernighan's book and thinking about the history of these tools. And stuff like LS, the tools and core utils, they were invented in the 60s and 70s by the Unix gang over at Bell Labs. But it made me wonder, these tools and the shell itself, there must be something ergonomic about them because we're still using them over 50 years later. And I can't imagine writing a tool like LS or MV or RM and at the time thinking, in 50 years, in 100 years, people are still going to be typing LS and MV and RM into shells in order to do something efficiently. I guess if they weren't ergonomic, they probably would have been replaced by something better, right? Is that a begging the question kind of question? Like you're just looking at your status quo and saying, well, it must have always turned out this way. And the turning out this way I'm asking about is the shell and all of these tools, are they ergonomic? And that's why we just continue to use them. What do you think? Is this maybe it's an impossible to pose question?
I think probably the shell turned out to be the sort of ideal environment for programmers. So people who were using computers, especially to write code, it just turned out to be the environment in which they wanted to work. And these tools were sort of the essential elements of that. I say that in part because I am very much still a shell guy. I use a very sophisticated Apple Macintosh with a complex visual interface, but I still use the terminal quite frequently. And even for things where there are pretty viable visual options, like I much prefer to use the shell to move files around as opposed to Filer. So,
And there's certain things like you can't even do them in the desktop, right? Like on POSIX systems, there's a split command. You ever use a split command? What a genius command this is. It's like, I've got this massive file and I just want you to split it into an arbitrary number of smaller files and just come up with some naming scheme for them. And usually it's like AAA, AAB, AAC. I freaking love this command. It doesn't exist on the desktop. I can't just right click and be like, hey, desktop, split this giant file into a bunch of smaller files for me so that I could do things on those smaller files.
Yeah, again, I think it's sort of the environment that if you're working with files and you're working with code, it's sort of the world that you want to inhabit.
But there's like this counterfactual urge that I have here to be like, why though? Why didn't we ever move past the shell? Why? Another way you could frame it, and you've seen me work. I'm a shell guy, and I don't have any judgments about it. I don't look down my nose at people who don't prefer the shell. All of my Git commands are in the shell. I'm one of those people, and there's nothing wrong with not using a shell for it. I guess the question that I have is, why are we stuck in a method of managing our computers that was invented and popularized in the 60s and 70s when they were using typewriters and spools of paper? Why are we still doing that? It's possible to imagine that people like us could have adopted some totally mouse and desktop way to do software dev because we're mostly using editors that are desktop. I mean, as you know, I was an Emacs guy for a long time. It took me to probably maybe 2016 to stop using Emacs as a daily user. And that's because I just didn't want to touch the mouse because it just felt like I was inefficient, slowing myself down every time I had to reach for this thing with these two buttons. It's like there's so much power in my fingertips, primarily through the keyboard. I guess a different way of asking this too is, what other ways of managing and interacting with our computers could be out there? And maybe mouse and desktop as an interface, it was pretty useful, but for the work we're doing, sort of incomplete. I mentioned split, and a lot of devs still are daily shell users. It's pretty common, I would say pervasive. But can we imagine other better ways? If we're still hardcore terminal users, what other possibilities for human computer interaction are out there waiting as a possible new way for us to interact? Is this a little too out there in space question? It feels maybe sci-fi.
Just just to lay the groundwork, we're not going to talk about neural implants in this episode.
Oh, yeah, I'm not interested in that myself, but no judgments if you are. The inspiration for this question or this set of questions comes from a friend of mine, Aaron. He pointed me, and Mike and I read this essay the title of the essay is The Computer for the 21st Century by Mark Weiser. Mark Weiser was the chief technologist at Xerox PARC in the 80s and 90s, and he coined this term, ubiquitous computing. And as I read this essay, I thought, wow, what might have been, what might still be. But I guess to even talk about him, we probably have to talk a little bit about Xerox PARC. What do you think, Mike? Our friend Bob, who's been on the show, actually got a tour of Xerox PARC in the 90s.
Yeah, we could mention it briefly. We don't probably want to go into it as deeply as we went into Bell Labs, but it's an interesting place.
They invented all kinds of stuff. Do you know anything they invented off the top of your head? I just know the mouse was invented there.
Yeah, well, for many years, people claimed that both Apple and or Microsoft stole the interface, for the Macintosh and for Windows from Xerox PARC. And that was essentially something that they invented, the visual interface with the mouse and multiple overlapping windows and things like that.
Mm-hmm. And the whole idea of the desktop, like a metaphor of having a desk with a bunch of
metaphor,
stuff.
Right?
Yeah.
There's a pretty good book about the early days of PARC called Dealers of Lightning, which talks about a lot of these people and the things that they invented. I think they also mention Smalltalk and Alan Key. Yeah.
So. And object-oriented programming invented there. They also invented e-ink, electronic paper, laser printing. And I think you told me this. They invented Ethernet. I didn't know that. That's crazy.
Yeah, Ethernet came out of there, and it was, as I understand it, took ideas from what was called Aloha Net, which was sort of an early networking technology that they used in Hawaii.
Oh, yeah, at University of Hawaii, they made that, yeah.
But that was like more radio-based, and Ethernet was using cables, but had similar ideas. And
so I read this Mark Weiser essay, The Computer for the 21st Century, and then I did my typical friend thing where I started banging on your door, Mike, and I said, you got to read this. Here's a quote. You got to read this. Here's another quote. You got to read this. Here's two more quotes. All in text message form, not the ideal way to read an essay, my friends. What do you think about the Mark Weiser essay about ubiquitous computing?
I found it pretty interesting. I had heard this term, of course. It became pretty common in the 90s and early 2000s, and then sort of faded a little bit.
I've never heard it.
Yeah, I think it was... I'm not sure if it faded from use because people thought we had achieved it, or if it faded from use because people thought it was irrelevant or what. But it was a thing that people talked about quite a bit in the 90s. His notion of it was pretty appealing. I think it also sort of morphed over the years. We'll talk a little bit later about what people have started to call ambient computing. I like his vision of it, which I'm not entirely sure has evolved into what we have today.
Yeah, same. Yeah, I was like, wow, this sounds interesting. It's like, and it's interesting as a vision of what could have been, but it's also interesting because this is 1991. The internet's not a thing really in 1991, and he's anticipating. I mean, it was a small scale thing that existed for very small groups of people, but it wasn't the thing that it became in the mid 90s and late 90s. And he's anticipating the future and saying, you can have ubiquitous computing. There's computers everywhere. And this is how it is to be a human being living in an environment, computers everywhere. I want to read a couple quotes for you from this paper. This is from the opening. Mark Weiser writes, the most profound technologies are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it. Consider writing, perhaps the first information technology. And he goes on. And then he writes, candy wrappers are covered in writing. So the constant background presence of these products of, quote, literacy technology, it doesn't require active attention. But the information to be conveyed is ready for use at a glance. It is difficult to imagine modern life otherwise. Is this so? He's talking about technologies that become ubiquitous and they disappear and become part of like the fabric of reality for us. So, writing is his example. And I think you could make the argument that maybe computers have done that in the form of probably smartphones and maybe IoT devices. But you could also maybe make the counter argument. I ride the trolley here in San Diego a few times a week. I get on the trolley, at least 95% of the people on the trolley are looking down at their phones. This is an observation that numerous people have made. Is that ubiquitous computing, Mike?
I do not think it is in the sense that Weiser had hoped would come.
Mm-hmm.
We could probably discuss this more later, but I think the sort of key distinction between what he was proposing and what we ended up with is the way that the devices demand your attention.
Or maybe I think you're right. You're totally right on that observation. I think it's also about how you interact with the computing environment. Like with writing, it sort of feels like it comes to us. And with computers, Weiser's like, let's imagine a world in which the computers come to us, not we go to them and engage with them in a specialized form that they can understand, that we can issue commands for them. So Weiser continues in this essay, even though there are like a ton of computers in the wild by 1991, he writes, more than 50 million personal computers have been sold, and nonetheless, the computer remains largely in a world of its own. It is approachable only through complex jargon that has nothing to do with the tasks for which people actually use computers. So that's like Core Udall saying at the beginning. The state of the art, he writes, is perhaps analogous to the period when scribes had to know as much about making ink or baking clay as they did about writing. Thus, he writes, we are trying to conceive a new way of thinking about computers in the world, one that takes into account the natural human environment and allows the computers themselves to vanish into the background. And I want to ask you what you think about these two paragraphs here, but the thing that I immediately struck me when I read this essay is, whoa, these people, Mark Weiser and his colleagues, they were so far ahead thinking about what our lived environment would be 20, 30, 40 years past when they were writing. And they made these really interesting predictions, and they tried to produce the conditions for this reality to emerge. They were so forward thinking. And oh, by the way, they also kind of missed the mark a little bit.
You have to admire what they predicted given the time that they predicted it.
Mm-hmm.
They did have access to networked computers because of the place where they worked, and they were familiar with internet protocols. And in a later essay, he talks about things like multicast. So, they were pretty deeply into what that technology might be able to do. But also, this is before anybody had conceived really of the Internet of Things. So there weren't a lot of devices. I mean, there probably were at PARC. They probably had networked soda machines or something. Mm-hmm. But there weren't a lot of devices on the internet that weren't computers. Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as a wearable. I think that idea was pretty much science fiction at this time. Mm-hmm. And this is well before there was anything resembling a cell phone. There might have been some primitive PDAs at that point in time, but certainly nothing even like the first versions of the iPhone.
Mm-hmm. I guess I want to ask this question for you, though. We're trying to conceive of this way of thinking about computers. He says, new way. It allows the computers themselves to vanish into the background. Here's my question for you, Mike. Does this appeal to you? Can you imagine an environment rich in computers where they, quote, vanish into the background Does that sound cool? Does that sound good?
I always had a little bit of trouble with this concept. It seemed like it was probably inevitable, but even if you read his descriptions of it, it feels a little creepy in certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about how there will be computers that sense your presence and react to your behaviors and your moods. So, they sense that you are arriving at work, and so they make sure there's coffee in the coffee machine, and they dim the lights or turn up the lights or various other things that sort of things that you probably would have done by yourself, but the computer can now sense and do for you. And it sounds interesting and useful in some ways, but also, do I really want to be that surveilled? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I can't help thinking that too. I have trouble because I feel like I'm historically naive. And I mean, like, I am someone's history speaking right now. And I have the naivety of the present tense of not being able to see the future. And I feel like I'm almost prejudiced by sci-fi because when I try to imagine what they're describing, it feels like I'm sort of imagining a sci-fi story, and it always goes off the rails. Like there's always a dark side to it. Like I can't just imagine some clean, beautiful future environment where there's computers all over the place and they're not just like inundating me with ads or something, or just constantly trying to read all of this data from my person so that they can use it to advertise or exploit or something. Surveillance is what you mentioned. Like I feel like incapable of projecting my mind into a future to even be able to conceive of this type of stuff working. The computers are vanishing in the background. I want to give you a chunk of the philosophical underpinnings of this essay that I really liked. And there's only one other. Yeah, so this is like one of the last quotes I want to give you from the essay. Mark Weiser writes, such a disappearance is a fundamental consequence not of technology, but of human psychology. When people learn something sufficiently well, they cease to be aware of it. And Mike, as we're reading this essay, you could probably see me getting like fired up about this comment from miles away because this is a comment I made at work a bunch of times. If you are using my software and you're thinking to yourself, "Oh, I'm using this software," then the software sucks, right? Like if I'm using a tool and I'm thinking about using it while I'm using it, if I'm reading a book and thinking, "Oh, there's a writer writing this book," I'm not really reading it. I'm not really enjoying it. It's when I lose myself. And as I'm sure you've heard me reference, but this comes straight out of Heidegger. It's the like, I am, it's the thing that's ready at hand. So continue on with the Weiser quote. When you look at a street sign, Weiser writes, for example, you absorb its information without consciously performing the act of reading. Computer scientist, economist, and Nobelist Herb Simon calls this phenomenon, quote, compiling. I'd never heard that. I want to know more. Philosopher Michael Polanyi calls it, quote, tacit dimension. Psychologist T.K. Gibson calls it, quote, visual invariance. And philosophers George Gadamer and Martin Heidegger call it, quote, the horizon. And ready to hand, John Seeley Brown at PARC calls it, quote, the periphery. All say, in essence, that only when things disappear in this way are we freed to use them without thinking, and so to focus beyond them on new goals. It's a bit of a heady topic. What do you think? Philosophical grounding for this idea?
So there's a certain appeal to me to this idea that, you use something long enough and it ceases to be something that you actively concentrate on. And it does seem like that's sort of what happens with most of our tools or most of the interfaces to our devices. I recently had this experience where I won't go into detail, but my personal vehicle became incapacitated and I had to rent a car. I got a car where the gear shift is actually a knob in the central console. So when I have to go from park to neutral, I have to reach into the center console and turn this knob to drive. And it's just very foreign and weird to me. And every time I do it, I have to stop and think about which way to turn it and how to figure out that I'm actually in drive.
It hasn't vanished it never vanishes into the background. It's always present.
Exactly. So, the idea that you build technology that eventually reaches a point where you don't think about how you're using it is, I think, the right idea. And I wish more stuff did that.
Yeah. Yeah. Background. Yeah, exactly. Stuff that fades is successful technology. Stuff that you're not consciously thinking about how it's made, how it works as you're using it. The Heidegger example is the hammer. If you're beholding the hammer as a piece of wood and metal, you're not hammering nails. As soon as you hammer nails, the hammer disappears entirely. It becomes an extension of the hand and the arm and the person using it. And they're like, I find it really fascinating that Weiser's reaching into this philosophical tradition to say that's what successful technology looks like, and that's how you know that our computing environment hasn't achieved what other technologies have before, and that's how you know we've got work to do. Is what Weiser's saying, and I'm like a complete sucker for this argument. I buy it completely. But on the other hand, Mike, I don't think about ls when I type ls into my shell. I don't think about the shell. I'm not thinking, how is the shell working? I don't think, what is the move command doing if I want to rename a file? I just type blah, blah, blah. Boom. And similarly, often when I write a language like Python, which I've written every day for 15 years practically now, I don't, I kind of can tune out. This is going to sound maybe bad, but I kind of do it without thinking. A lot of stuff. It's like there are certain programming tasks where I have to like wake up my brain and go, oh, wait a minute, I got to really think about this. But there's a sort of fluidity to it. I could almost do it without thinking, like just start typing function definitions and class definitions. And you know what I mean? You just start moving your fingers and the crap just starts flowing out of you. That's a kind of tool use, right?
I think so. And I think it's probably also why it's very difficult to switch between languages sometimes. Like I've had these cases in the past where I was using multiple languages at the same time, and all of a sudden I start typing semicolons at the ends of lines of Python code.
Yeah, I would do that with Python and TypeScript and JavaScript, where I would like uppercase and lowercase true and false in the wrong language. So what does ubiquitous computing actually look like for Weiser? He gets this like big philosophical grounding. He's saying this is what we should try to produce. This is really, truly successful technology. We're in our infancy with computers, he's saying, in 1991. And so he gives these examples from Xerox PARC, things that they built. He writes, and this is the last quote I have for you from this paper, ubiquitous computers will also come in different sizes, each suited to a particular task. My colleagues and I have built what we call tabs, pads, and boards, inch scale machines that approximate active post-it notes. Those are tabs. They're like little PDAs. Foot scale ones that behave something like a sheet of paper, like you could imagine like an e-reader or like a legal notepad or something. He writes a book or a magazine. And yard scale displays that are the equivalent of a blackboard or a bulletin board. So there's like smart PDA tab things. There's smart e-ink reader things called pads. And then there's these smart whiteboards called boards. And he sort of describes how like you walk around the building at Xerox PARC and all of your documents, they follow you from room to room. You've got some sort of thing on your person that says, oh, Eric has entered the room and Mike has come with them. Let me make sure that all of the things they've been working on are immediately readily available on the board. And there are all these pads around that they can use to take notes. What do you think about this vision?
I liked the vision, but I think there's this tendency that we now sort of start to equate those devices with things that exist in our world. So we think of the small thing as probably being our cell phones, and the medium thing as being tablets or our laptops, and the large thing as being the screen where we do our Google Meets or whatever. The infrastructure that a lot of that's built on, as opposed to what they were doing at PARC, the sort of background element of that now is cloud computing rather than what they probably had available inside the building at PARC.
I think the analogy you draw is really good, because there's a way in which you could read Weiser's essay and say, there's an argument that you could make that the tabs, pads, and boards he described is exactly what we ended up with mobile phones, smartphones. We ended up with tablets and laptops, and we ended up with big screens that we could do screen sharing on. But there's maybe an argument you can make that no, he's like we're still too presently interacting with these things. They're not background enough. They haven't vanished into the background, and I think that's what's really interesting. Where the argument gets really interesting, it hinges on this idea. And why is it interesting? Because Weiser is not only saying we should do this, he's making a prediction. He's saying that technology will continue to evolve until that happens, because that's how human psychology works. The developments will continue to accelerate or to continue to sort of feed off of each other, to iterate until you get to a point where it's like a hammer, where you use it without thinking. And I guess it's like look when the economists look at and say, "Are we in a recession yet?" That's what we're doing here, Mike. Are we in ubiquitous computing yet? Weiser's saying we're going to get there. He's not saying, "Oh, it might not happen." He's saying it'll happen eventually. So the interesting contrast, though, is a smartphone, right? There is a project at MIT called Project Oxygen, which I hadn't heard about. I was just reading background for this to understand this ubiquitous computing topic. And they argue at Project Oxygen at MIT that the smartphone doesn't count as a ubiquitous computing device. And they go like, this sounds really out there to me, but in the future, they write, computation will be human-centered. It will be freely available everywhere, like batteries or power sockets. Sidebar, are batteries and power sockets freely available everywhere? I don't think so. But continuing on. Or oxygen in the air we breathe. And I just like really chafe against like comparing oxygen to batteries and power sockets. Anyway, they write, we will not need to carry our own devices around with us. So that's their interpretation of what Weiser's talking about. I think it's a fair interpretation of the essay. You don't have to carry anything around. There's just computing all around you. That doesn't seem like it's going to happen. What do you think?
My impression of what Weiser was getting at was the tab things in particular were very simple and essentially disposable. You know, they weren't necessarily fragile, but they were meant to be cheap and readily available, and something that you might have multiple of lying around. So I think it's more like what they're talking about in this Oxygen project than what cell phones have evolved into. I think somebody else made this point in one of these articles about how cell phones now are $1,000, and that's certainly not what Weiser was getting at with the tabs.
Mm-hmm. It has to be cheap and ubiquitous, but computers are not like paper, right? You can make paper from tree bark. Yeah, it's not that easy. Yeah, to mass produce it's not that easy. But you can't make a computer from well, okay. you can't make the kind of computer that produces an LLM out of tree bark. Am I wrong about that?
As far as I know, you are correct.
Although I did read the article this week about a guy who made a language agent in Minecraft. Okay.
Yeah, I saw that too.
So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you cannot make an LLM out of tree bark. You can make paper out of tree bark. You can make signs out of a piece of wood and a piece of charcoal, right? These technologies don't take a lot to produce. And when you start talking about computers, there's rare earth metals in there, right? It takes a lot of money and knowledge and expertise and a lot of myriad different tiny little pieces to go in there. I can't imagine that's ever just going to be ubiquitous and cheap.
Well, there are cheap computing devices, you know, Arduinos and Raspberry Pis and stuff like that, and I believe even cheaper versions of those prototyping boards and stuff like that. So the idea of having less expensive devices is not too implausible to me. But, you know, as you say, even something that's like a $50 prototyping board, a lot goes into that, you know, that there's sort of a huge global supply chain that is necessary to make that thing possible.
I mean, just making those things throwawayable, disposable is the word I want, ephemeral. Like there's just something that I resist in that idea. Like It's like we're just going to make heaps of mountains of toxic waste out of these. Okay, moving on. So Weiser actually talks about virtual reality because you might think, well, wait a minute, is virtual reality, and virtual reality, of course, was big in the 90s, is that a realization of your vision? And Weiser it pretty savagely bashes VR, and he sort of is like, this is the opposite of what I'm talking about. Let me read to you the quote about virtual reality. He says, perhaps most diametrically opposed to our vision is the notion of, quote, virtual reality, which attempts to make a world inside the computer. And he's like, it may have a purpose. Like you can explore things that are otherwise inaccessible, cells, surfaces of planets, information web of complex DBs. Virtual reality is only a map, he says, not a territory. It excludes desks, offices, other people not wearing goggles and bodysuits, weather, grass, trees, walks, chance encounters, and in general, the infinite richness of the universe. Virtual reality, he writes, focuses an enormous apparatus on simulating the world rather than on invisibly enhancing the world that already exists. I kind of was like, yeah, bash that VR.
It's very hard to argue with that. And
Yeah, I
think
found
they
it too,
do.
yeah.
They do recognize that there might be specialist applications of VR which are very useful, but they are certainly not what was intended by ubiquitous computing.
I mean, I think this argument appealed to me because I was like, yeah, you're exactly right. If you are going into that VR world, you're leaving the world to enter this other world. I mean, maybe you could argue the same about video games. So people are sort of like shedding or maybe reading a book. Like I'm leaving my environment. I'm reading a book. I'm withdrawing from the society around me. But I think this argument, aside from just bashing VR, that's sort of like personally satisfying. It surfaces again what he's trying to get at, like invisibly enriching our actual environment is what he wants to see. And I find this essay so fascinating because I can't imagine what that could look like if it's not a lot of people staring at their phones on mass transit. So tell me what else where so I had never heard the term ubiquitous computing. You said it was a kind of popular term and then it morphed into other things. Where did it go? What did it become? Like what other ideas are out there inspired by this or evolved out of this?
So I think if you ask somebody today who is still involved in this field, they would say that we have essentially achieved ubiquitous computing. And they would point to things like cell phones, wearables, tablets,
smart refrigerators, smart toilets.
Yeah, all the IoT devices, the Ring cameras and the Alexas and the home automation stuff. And, so I think there's a certain set of people who think we don't use the term ubiquitous computing because it's just computing now. It's, that's the world we live in. Nobody focuses on the desktop anymore. Most people interact with the world and the internet through phones and wearables now, or even to some extent the personal assistants like Alexa. So I think the vision of not having this specialized environment like a PC desktop to do computing has, in some sense, been achieved. But the flip side of that is it clearly was not the on the periphery, melting into the background sort of technology that Weiser was talking about.
You mentioned to me there's a term called calm technology. Where'd you hear about this? I had never heard calm technology. Sounds nice.
Yeah, that's another thing from Weiser and a collaborator. He talks. It's very similar to the ubiquitous computing idea, but he talks about. Well, let me read a couple of lines from this. Designs that calm and inform meet two human needs not usually met together: information technology is often more the enemy of calm. Pagers, cell phones, news services, the World Wide Web, email, TV, and radio bombard us frenetically. Can we really look to technology itself for a solution? Some technology does lead to true calm and comfort. The pen, the shoe, we believe the difference is in how they engage our attention. Calm technology engages both the center and the periphery of our attention, and in fact moves back and forth between the two. We use periphery to name what we are attuned to without attending to explicitly.
The pen and the shoe are calm technology, and the computer just not there yet, Mike.
So I think this idea of things which we are attuned to but do not attend to is right on the money, if maybe a little bit hard to parse. But
it's like there's something about it's making demands on my attention. It's making claims on my attention. It's not just a thing I can passively receive as I'm sort of living. Like it changes my mode of consciousness as I'm engaging with information technology, I think is what he's saying. Like putting a shoe on doesn't change my mode of consciousness. It's so background. Is that fair? Am I interpreting it right? It's like, this is pretty philosophically wooey a little bit.
The example that he uses in this article is when you're driving, you don't really pay attention to the engine noise. You know that your car has an engine, and you might occasionally realize that it's making noise that is sort of in the background in the environment that you're in. But you don't really focus any attention on the engine noise, except when something happens that causes your engine to make a noise that it's not supposed to make. And then it suddenly grabs pretty much all of your attention. That's sort of the total opposite of the way our mobile devices treat us.
Is this a complaint maybe that our computing environment is not ignorable enough, Mike? I can't live my life ignoring computers enough yet. Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, I think so. In my view, it is. I mean, clearly a lot of the applications are designed to try to hold your attention. And if they're not holding your attention, they have notification systems to try to regain your attention. And so I think the design of most of our devices is a little bit contrary to what Weiser was hoping to achieve with ubiquitous computing.
And that's probably because holding my attention is profitable, right? Being a thing that fades into the background is not an easy road to having this big moat where users show up and hand over their data or their money. You told me about another term called ambient computing, and you sent me this article from this year, actually, from September 2025, called Ambient Computing Has Arrived. Here's what it looks like in my house. This article has this lovely quote in it from Brian Eno. I want to read that. And I was like, whoa, I've never seen this quote before at Beyond Computing. I'm now going to think about it a lot. But the writer says, instead of ubiquitous computing, we're being drawn to another wave, one that takes Weiser's ubiquitous computing vision and mixes it with the Internet of Things, machine learning, and the hyperscale compute cloud to deliver what's being called, quote, ambient computing. As an alternative to traditional computing models, ambient computing takes its cue from musician Brian Eno, who, in coining the term, quote, ambient music for his slow compositions, described it as something that, quote, must be as ignorable as it is interesting.
That is,
what does that even mean? It must be as ignorable as it. This sounds like a contradiction in terms, right? If something is ignorable, is it interesting still? Brian, is like, it must be interesting and ignorable to the same degree. What?
Yeah, it does seem a little hard to quantify, but there's also something maybe profound in there. I'm not sure.
Do you listen to Brian Eno? Did you ever listen to Brian Eno?
A little bit. I confess it's the ambient stuff is not really my cup of tea.
Yeah, me either. I do like Philip Glass, though. That's maybe, but that's Is that it's not ignorable from I don't know. All right, I can't deal with this quote. But what if the computing environment is as ignorable as it is interesting? That's what's being posed here. Ambient computing. The writer of this article gives an example of his home heating system. He says he lives in Europe. They have similar home heating systems throughout homes in Europe, and his home heating system like learns the environment, it learns the climate of where his house is. It sort of anticipates when to heat up and when to cool down. He says that in addition to this kind of active, passively active, I don't know how to phrase this, but like ignorable. In addition to this ignorable computation that's happening in his house, there's also ambient computing presents information to him in different ways. And this sounds like what Weiser wanted at Calm Technology. It's like you don't go out and say what's the weather today, and you have to bring up these websites with all these ads all over them. Instead, you could imagine that you've got some sort of like projection on your ceiling of clouds or no clouds, and it's presenting you this information that the writer says an ambient interface needs to be glanceable. And so that's as ignorable as it is interesting. This quote is going to drive me nuts, I think, for a long time.
I like the term glanceable, though.
Glanceable is pretty good, yeah. And that does sound like what Weiser wanted, right? Like, I don't have to actively promote like all of my attention on the thing. I want to be able to ignore it. But here's where I get to a market question for you, Mike. It doesn't seem like we live in a world where this type of computing is that valuable for companies to produce, right? I mean, it's all about capturing your attention. Like, who really wants to build this for us? It does sound nice. If Calm Technology sounds nice, like a nice jacuzzi of technology that I get into every day. I don't know what it really is. Is that going to happen?
The closest thing I can think of that's like this is the assistant technologies, which have their own problems. So
you mean like personal surveillance devices like Alexa?
Yes. For example, we have an Alexa in our home. I did not purchase it because I don't trust such devices, but I do not live in my house alone, so we have an Alexa.
Okay.
And probably 50% of the time that we use the Alexa, it's to put on music for our dog when we leave the house.
So your dog is experiencing ambient computing.
Yeah, so the thing sits there. It doesn't interrupt us usually. It does occasionally, but it doesn't usually interrupt us, and you can ask it to do things for you, and that's nice. It's not really super smart, like it doesn't know what the temperature of my living room is, and it doesn't, I don't have it hooked up to other devices to turn things off or turn things up and down. Mm-hmm. But, it's not obnoxious, and it doesn't demand attention. So I think that sort of fits in. I don't particularly like them myself because I feel like they inevitably have to be listening to you all the time. Mm-hmm. And anybody who has one of these things has probably experienced the thing where you are talking about something and then you get an ad for it. And that may be total coincidence, but it feels weird. So
when I read the Weiser piece, I read this ambient computing piece, I have this feeling of wonder, like, wow, it was so fascinating what people like Mark Weiser were able to envision and predict. And then also, wow, how might it have been and what might still come? But then I also have this naive cynic that's like, this is not going to happen. My attention is too valuable, Mike. There's no way somebody's going to make a calm technology environment for me. Maybe I'm too cynical. I mean, I'm naive. Obviously, I don't have the vision to imagine the future at all. I'm just stupidly commenting on what I see right now.
Yeah, well, even the things that are designed to be sort of invisible are still there to sell you things. or to at least facilitate buying things. I think you're correct in that there's not really a market. There's not too much of a market yet for things which are helpful to you, which do not also try to grab your attention or collect data about you that they can either exploit or sell.
I feel like if that were to exist, like you'd have to build it yourself. You'd have to go out and get the Raspberry Pis and build your environment. I mean, maybe the smart home thing, maybe it could be not a surveillance tool, but maybe we don't have enough trust. So you gave me another interesting example of ubiquitous operating systems. This is like an ACM piece, I think, right?
Yeah, I came across. So I kind of asked myself this question of, I've been mostly a back end / data engineering sort of programmer for the last decade or two. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the programming world that I think about. I'm typically writing code on the screen of a laptop or a desktop, and
typically using a shell all day long. LS,
typically
MV,
using a
RM.
shell and pushing stuff to the code, pushing stuff to the cloud with whatever framework I happen to be using at the time. But so I started to ask myself a question of, suppose that I'm going to program ubiquitous computing devices, IoT devices or home assistants or home automation or that kind of thing. How do I do that? Where do I start? And so I came across this article.
It was toward ubiquitous operating systems, lessons from the field. That was it. It was in the ACM. I don't know what area.
Communications of the ACM from September.
And it was an opinion piece in the category of artificial intelligence and machine learning.
It talks about how there's a slight difference in operating system philosophy for these IoT devices and ubiquitous computing devices. A lot of times we end up with using Android or Unix or Linux or whatever, but there are apparently specialized operating systems specifically for ubiquitous computing devices, which are called ubiquitous operating systems. I had never heard this term before. I was not aware that it was a thing, but apparently it's an emerging technology. And there are
this is another recent piece, right? It was just published. Oh, this is the one that was published in September 2025. Sorry, this one was. I was probably wrong about the other one, but they give an example of like a hospital room. You might have all kinds of devices with computers inside, and you might also have an ambulance delivering a patient to the hospital. And if everything from the ambulance to all the devices in the room were running these ubiquitous operating systems, you could imagine patient vitals and other really key data getting collected in the ambulance magically, instantaneously, maybe not instantaneously, transferred to these operating systems. They'll just share activities, they'll share data across each other. So that sounds kind of cool.
Yeah, and they make the point in this article that it's kind of a shift in mindset a little bit. There's a couple of specific examples they mentioned. There's one called the Fuchsia OS.
Oh, yeah. Wasn't that a Google-developed operating system, I thought?
Yeah, Fuchsia, I believe, came out of Google. And then there's Harmony OS, which I believe came out of Huawei. Apparently, there are some differences in the way that you need to think about building systems for ubiquitous computing and down to the operating system level, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Well, the idea too is that these operating systems they exist in a world in which they expect other OSs to also exist that they can like seamlessly communicate with. In the ACM piece, they write developers can define easily multi-device activities, and I highlighted easily as, of course, because we've read a lot of the distributed system stuff, but we'll leave that for a second. Leaving low-level functions to ubiquitous operating systems. From the perspective of applications, cross-device communication and hardware access are no longer integrated as part of each application, but as a system-level infrastructure serving all the applications. So let me try to dumb this down. You can write ambulance software, which sort of just expects to be running on a bunch of different devices that are near each other, and they kind of magically, like the data of the program that you've written just sort of magically propagates itself or spreads around from device to device. That sounds kind of cool. It sounds useful in a medical context. Immediately my thought is, well, who's going to build that? Don't you feel like these companies love moats, right? Like they're going to be like, oh, sure, yeah, you can easily share your stuff from, but I mean, within their own systems, I can imagine. But it's the classic, like we're building walls so that we can continue to sell our Betamax tapes.
Yeah, it does really sort of seem hard to imagine that these companies are going to collaborate to that level. But
it sounds idealistic.
It does, yeah. It's an interesting problem, though. It has a lot of the same issues that we've talked about with respect to distributed systems.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like if in these types of devices, you probably have to be careful about making sure that the clocks are synchronized in some way, because there's likely to be, you know, time-sensitive information, like in the medical example you gave.
They said that I didn't know this is just a little detail, that the clock skew on smartphones is like up to 100 milliseconds typically. It's like, what? Wow. Okay. Good to know. So
that's a lot of milliseconds.
Yeah, 100 of them. The I guess like medical systems seem easy to imagine, where there's some utility and value in having ubiquitous computing. Like I use the smart toilet, and it instantly analyzes whatever goes into the smart toilet. And I go into the smart ambulance, and it instantly analyzes all of my vitals, and those get instantly transferred over to the smart emergency room. Other contexts are harder for me to imagine. And I still go back to this question I started with, Mike. We're still using these shell tools. We're still typing commands into a CLI as the most efficient and maybe even ergonomic way to do computation, to trigger computation, to trigger data management and file management and things like that. It feels like we're almost as far from ubiquitous computing as when Mark Weiser first talked about it. Obviously, some steps, a lot of progress has been made. I just don't know if I buy it. I don't know if I buy the prediction that eventually computing will be invisible. It will vanish into the background.
It's going to be like oxygen.
I'm too cynical for that. Computers as oxygen. I don't know. It just sounds so sci-fi too.
Not only sounds sci-fi, it's probably to some extent derived from sci-fi. I mean, I think people have this image, well, nerdy people have this image of something like, you know, the Starship Enterprise, where, you know, you can just ask the computer to find stuff for you, or, you know, you can ask the computer where somebody is because they've got their sensor badge on. I don't necessarily know if that's all good stuff, but I think that's probably to some extent where the vision of this kind of thing came from.
Yeah, I mean, if you take that, though, what's actually happening there? They're flying in a spaceship. The spaceship is a giant computer.
Yeah.
So in that case, if you just sort of enmesh your whole person inside a computer and operate in the world that way, yeah, maybe the smartphone is the way this is going to happen. I don't know. Listeners, what do you think? Is ubiquitous computing still going to happen? Did it happen? Are we ever going to move beyond shell utilities for manipulating computers as developers? There's a lot of questions that we've laid out there on a buffet and not bothered to answer.
I read an article this morning that we are recording, about how somebody predicted that the singularity will happen in the next 3 months. So,
whoa.
Yeah.
What's the over under on that, Mike? My vote is that will not happen in the next 3 months.
Yeah, I would take that bet as well. But, you know,
I'm going to short that stock.
Just to be on the safe side, if that does happen, then probably ubiquitous computing matters a little bit less.
Oh, okay.
Or
I thought you were
maybe
going to say,
that is ubiquitous computing because everything then is computers.
buy gold. Well, thanks for reading the Weiser essay with me, Mike. Listeners, if you'd like to check it out, it's totally readable. It is called The Computer for the 21st Century. We may have had to read it on an archive. Yeah, there's a web archive link that we will share, so you can check this essay out yourself. If you'd like to get in touch with us, we are at podcast@picturemecoding.com. You can reach us on Blue Sky. We have a Picture Me Coding account there. And if you'd like to support the show, we do have a Patreon called Picture Me Coding. For $4 a month, you can send us support. And we will use your support to continue to produce, to record, to edit the show, and to publish it. Thanks so much for listening. This has been Picture Me Coding with Eric Aker and Mike Mull. We'll see you again in a couple weeks.
See you next time.